on this time.
Yeah, there's.
All right, everyone. Thank y'all so much for waiting. It's let's see now, 10:02, so 2 minutes past. Apologize for it being so cold in here. We asked about trying to warm it up, but it doesn't sound like it's going to be a possibility. So on today's panel, we have advancing decarbonization strategies through verifiable technology and certification is what we're going to be talking about. We'll be going through a list of questions for our guest here. And I'm going to first start out with some introductions as well. So my name is Jamie Elrod. I'm the Early Engagement Leader for the Americas for Baker Hughes and the Emissions Management Division. And today with me from Baker Hughes, I have Maria Lozano. She's the Product Manager for Emissions Management, specifically looking at responsibly sourced gas and also the certifications that you can get through that process. We have Lara Owens. She's the Director of Science and Technology from MIQ, and Jennifer Stewart. She's the Principal Advisor for Equitable Origin. What's really great about our guests is they actually do a lot more than just that. So I really wanted to kind of get into some of the other things that they do in the industry. And so for starting off, Lara, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and other hats that you wear instead of, just the MIQ one?
Happy to. So I work for an NGO called Rocky Mountain Institute. RMI is to be rebranded. RMI is a NGO that's really focused on if we're going to reach a 1.5 degree future. So if we're going to meet our Paris climate commitments, there are 10, 20 different ways that we can do this today that are faster and more efficient than trying to change every industry and try to make every industry steer a big ship in a new direction. So some of the tools that we use are markets and technology. That's the two elements that RMI focuses on. Other NGOs are better at policy advocation. Other NGOs are better at trying to work on specific issues as a global incentive. But what we do and what we do well is we work with industry. We talk to industry, we engage with industry. So a big part of what I do is a lot of work with these industry coalitions and trying to understand their learnings. And this is not just for oil and gas, but this is for landfills. This is for other segments that have a lot of methane risk. I also work with a team that does emissions visibility. So our whole goal is trying to understand, well, what is the gap? What is the big opportunity for emissions reduction? So we partner with a handful of research institutions and one NGO called Carbon Mapper, another called Climate Trace, where we're really trying to map the global emissions from the oil and gas sector, from the various segments of that the oil and gas supply chain to see, okay, where is the we can target? What regulations are going to be most effective? So that whole emissions visibility component is something that I get to spend a lot of time doing, talking to satellite providers and talking to the scientists that use that data.
Thank you for that explanation. Maria, you also do a lot of other things besides, just your position here at Baker Hughes and also through your studies. So can you kind of give us a little bit more background on that?
Sure. So yeah, Maria Lozano, I'm part of the team at HSE on emissions management, but I do several other things outside of Baker Hughes. So I'm part of a group called MB4G, that is a non-profit organization. It's a group of all kinds of people from different backgrounds, coming from research, academia, private sector, and even students. We have some students with us as well. And what we do is research in different topics. We have around 5 work streams that we work on. And one of the 2 work streams that I'm part of is environmental. And we do research in several areas, from wildlife all the way to emissions management, which is what I do. And I'm also part of the Latin American work stream that is also an area that is trying to do research to understand what else can be done in Latin America in terms of energy and energy transition. So those are 2 areas that we are working in as part of this organization called MD4G, or Mechanisms Designed for Social Good. And it was created, as a group of people who graduated from university, and it's quite exciting to be part of that. And I'm also part of another group within the Rice University, that is the Young Professionals Roundtable, and we come together to discuss also the different topics within the energy sector. So I guess coming out of university, not too recently, but a couple of 3 years ago, it's been quite exciting to see the advance of the dialogue when it comes to energy transition and emissions management nowadays. Because several years ago, I didn't see that, and I haven't seen that much traction in emissions management as I have seen in the past 24 months. So it's very exciting times to be in this area, I would say. So that's pretty much.
Thanks, Maria. And Jennifer?
Hi, Jennifer Stewart. I retired a few years ago from Southwestern Energy, and since then I've tried to retire and work very long. And so I wear a few hats. So the hat I have today is a principal advisor with Equitable Origin, and will be that's a certification body that certifies natural gas and light oil on an independent basis. And then I'm also on the board of an oil field services company. I'm on the advisory board for Publicis Sapient Energy and Commodities Practice. And I'm also part of a team that is seeking to export LNG out of the Northeast, it's called Penn LNG. So all of these roles are cross over. They're all interchangeable and interdependent. And
Thank you. I just think it's pretty amazing all the other things that our panelists do. And then for myself, I actually host and co-founder of a podcast called Flipping the Barrel, where we actually share the stories of those in energy. And it really shines a light on what we're doing in oil and gas and other sectors, and the stories behind the people that are working in those industries. And we also host events for women in energy as well. So there's just a lot of things that we do outside of our everyday work, and I think we all can appreciate that. So getting into our questions here, just so that the audience knows, Laura, can you give an explanation on really what MIQ is and what that certification means?
So MIQ is it's a certification program, and that certification program holds two main functions. It creates and updates a standard around methane performance, and we grade gas based on methane performance A through F. So this is grading all gas, not just the A's and the B's and the gold stars. But we also maintain a registry, and that registry is how we track those graded attributes through that program. So in this independent governance, we're really trying to connect the dots between all those different elements, the technology providers and the third-party auditors, and help them be part of this this program.
And Jennifer, can you explain Equitable Origin?
so Equitable Origin is I like to call it a sister organization to MIQ, but we do have a little different focus. We are nonprofit, we are independent, but we focus on the entire ESG spectrum. So in order to get natural gas or light oil or gathering and boosting assets certified, you have to meet criteria under five different ESG elements, and those include corporate governance, health, safety, and labor, community engagement, of course, biodiversity, climate, greenhouse gas emissions, and then how EO got its start was with respect to indigenous people's rights, particularly in Latin and South America, with respect to energy development. And what we say is we're here to promote responsible energy development. We're agnostic as to the source of energy, what we do is that makes it a heavy lift for producers, but they're meeting the challenge, is attesting to all elements of ESG.
Thank you for that. So, Laura, I think what would be interesting to kind of talk about with MIQ is it is one of the most robust and widely adopted methane specific certifications available today, and there is some other ones on the market. What sets MIQ apart, and what would make an operator, go to MIQ over another certification program?
So one of the things that we designed the program to specifically include were a handful of elements that I kind of talked about in the earlier talk. So, and this should be what all programs, all certification programs, if you follow the ICO principles, if you look at certification programs that have been successful and have been credible over time, they're transparent. So our standard is transparent. It is something that is, it's up on our website, and this is something that EO also does. It went through extensive stakeholder feedback in order to generate the details of that standard. That standard is available for all stakeholders who are using the certification to be able to compare themselves apples to apples. We're nonprofits, so we're not looking to actually cut into any of that cost recovery that is being achieved with certification. And also, you know what, we're happy to go home tomorrow if this all gets worked out. We're technology neutral, and this is for lots of really, really good reasons. And we're seeing how quickly technology is scaling and how great the capabilities are and how fastly they're developing. We want the market to be able to enhance that. And we require third-party auditors. So compared to all the other certifications out there that focus just on methane, we're the only ones that have those core principles. And the other is about scale. So we require a basin-wide certification. We do not allow for cherry picking pad by pad because that is not going to solve climate change. That's not going to reduce emissions on a larger scale.
And so Jennifer, I know that there's been some times where MIQ and Equitable Origin actually partner on a few things or they do things in conjunction. How do you complement MIQ and their focus? And because you did mention earlier that it is like a broader spectrum, so you do look at other things. Can you kind of explain a little bit how that works?
Yes, I think we complement each other very well, and that as Laura has mentioned, they focus solely on methane intensity, but it's a very, very deep dive, very robust dive into methane intensity, and looks at top-down measurements, bottom-up measurements, emissions factors, a very, very robust analysis where we don't go as deep into methane intensity as MIQ because we have 5 other principles that we feel are equally as important in the ESG spectrum. So that's where if a producer, we have a relationship where everything that Laura said on transparency, independent, nonprofit, technology neutral, basin, that's exactly the same with EO. So our models are somewhat similar. And a producer, if they want to get EO and MIQ certified, they can use the same assessment bodies and can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So I feel that if a producer or midstream company wants to establish themselves with certification, they have the opportunity to do it both with MIQ, which indicates their commitment to reducing methane intensity, but also with EO, which encompasses the entire ESG spectrum. So they kind of hit two goals at the same time if they decide to go with both.
And so with both of these certifications, it's really good to note that you have to have technology really to get there. So Maria, when it comes to Baker Hughes, how collaborating with the existing certifications, you know, and I guess it is also good to note that it's voluntary. The certifications are not standardized. Like it's not like you don't have to do it. It's voluntary, but the technology as well is something that helps the operators get to that point. And so Maria, to that, how does Baker Hughes collaborate with, you know, both MIQ and EO, and what technologies help operators drive to get that more, you know, cleaner gas and be able to be certified?
Yeah, I would say that from a technology standpoint, you know, we are, I'm not going to say we're technology agnostic, right? But we are trying to keep an eye on the latest developments because really the technology is going to continue to evolve. So the fact that we have both technologies, Lumen, Terrain, and Sky today doesn't mean that we're not going to evolve with the market. So we're trying to keep an eye on, you know, those technology developments because we understand that in order to scale technology, in order to scale it at the level that needs to be, we need to really drive the cost down, and we really need to work with that because I guess the market that in which we play today is very cost sensitive. So we really need to continue to make developments, and we really need to continue to drive the cost down there. So, you know, we have 2 technologies today that are have been applied. We have worked with a customer that you might have seen some announcements there on Northeast Natural Energy. they are a great example on, a company that wants to go above and beyond, that really doesn't have to do it, but they have decided to do it as part of their strategy, and they decided to go with both certifications. So that's a great example of how we could collaborate with these certifications that are transparent, that are independently audited, that are very robust, and that's the feedback that I usually get from some customers that I talk to. Why would you choose MIQ or Equitable Origin? And that's the answer, right? They think it's robust enough to provide enough evidence whenever they have to report that or to make that visible to any other third party that wants to have more visibility on their requirements and the documentation that they have to provide. So that's one aspect. And as I said, right, we're really trying to keep an eye, open eyes to the ways in which we need to evolve to continue to make technological advancements. So
You mentioned two products, Lumen, Terrain, and Sky. Just in case people don't know what they are and what they do, can you just give a little quick snip on how those products apply?
sure. So Lumen Terrain is a continuous monitoring solution. It's basically called an industrial Internet of Things solution. So basically what it does is, is a wireless network of sensors that is spread around your facility. We have a tool that is called Spot that basically simulates the ideal number of sensors that your facility should have. So we don't put sensors for the sake of adding sensors to your site. We actually try to optimize the ideal number of sensors that are ideal for the sites and the location and the conditions of your operational site. And then that's how it works. It has a base station that sort of connects the rest of the sensors to it and provides and generates the communication and transmits the data to the cloud. And then, you obviously get a bunch of data every 4 seconds. You are getting readings and you can there's an infinite multiple number of things that you can do with that data. And that's the purpose of having a solution like that, so that you're able to understand what are your major offenders or what are your major emission sources, and then you can enable actions to reduce your emissions. And then Lumen Sky is a drone that basically inspects your site. Obviously, the periodicity of the inspections is going to vary. You can do it once a year, twice a year, quarterly, depending on your emissions program. And it's going to generate a digital twin of your site, which I think that's one of the very important things of Sky, that you can see to a very, very, very in a very detailed way where your emission is coming from, so that you can go and fix it. And that's kind of how we empower the emissions reduction, just giving visibility on what are your emissions, so that you can go and take some action on that. Yeah.
Thank you for that explanation, Maria. So going back to the certifications, I think what's also important for the audience to know is that there's different levels in both of y'all's type of certifications. So starting with you, Laura, what is the minimum requirement between each of the certifications and the levels, and how did y'all come to that in creating those levels, I guess?
Sure. So again, with MIQ, we don't just grade good gas, we grade all gas. And so we do have a very minimum threshold to even enter into certification. And with the 3 pillars that MIQ has, which is the methane intensity, at least as per your calculated emissions over throughput. So it's basically your leakage. And then you have your monitoring technology requirements. So the higher grades have more monitoring, the lower grades have no they have minimum amounts of monitoring. And then there's the best practices. We have a 14-point system for production and a 20-point system for boosting gathering, et cetera, et cetera. There are minimums that you need to comply with in order to enter. And the threshold is still robust enough to be able to get companies on this continual path. So as they move towards what we would probably say is a 0.2% methane intensity, this is something that for the whole supply chain is potentially considered RSG. You have an option to move from, say, an E to, which is roughly what US pipeline quality gas is right now, at least within our standard, around 1% leakage. It's also important to understand that we have a bucket concept, because you can't precisely quantify everybody without a glass dome right now. We have to use all the tools and all the layers and all the options for understanding performance. So what you get from partaking in certification is you can start with an E grade. You can say I'm pipeline quality, and there are buyers that want to see continuous improvement. So they want to see that you have a commitment to move to a C grade. It should move to a 0.28% methane intensity over time. That's an 80% reduction. That's not nothing. So that's why we have all these various different layers. It's really not just hand a company an audit that says this is what you want. This is what you have to do over the next year or so in order to make improvement.
So it gives them the scalability
Exactly.
to start somewhere and then to eventually get better.
And not necessarily on their whole company. They can do various basics here, or different segments.
And Jennifer, y'all have this a similar STEP program, but different as far as your certification is different as well. Can you kind of explain?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a difference, particularly on the methane intensity side. We do not have a minimum threshold for certification for methane intensity, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, because we are broad, there's four other concepts or four other principles that need to be addressed and evaluated. The methane intensity is just one, but primarily it's because we don't want to discourage a producer from coming forward and getting EO certification because they have poor methane intensity. Because what we do require is a continuous improvement plan that we test on an annual basis for 3 years. So we do expect, if your methane intensity is not a good number, that relative to what MIQ's minimum standard is, that we expect improvement, and we want to see, you have to submit a continuous improvement plan in order to be certified with us. And the second reason is that we feel that we don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do what MIQ does with respect to the various measurement capabilities and technologies. But we do feel that emissions factors right now, the EPA emissions factors, are wrong. And they could be wrong in a good way, they could be wrong in a bad way. That we don't know, but we do know that they're wrong. And so we don't want to anchor right now on a methane intensity that is based only on emissions factors, because we feel that as the technology improves and there becomes more and more requirement, that MIQ is proposing, and Veritas and other bodies of standardization, as real measurements come in, we may see our producers under a factor have a methane intensity of 0.0 something, but once they really measure, they're going to be at a 5. I mean, I'm using a, so we don't want to say, okay, you're certified now on emissions factors, but 2 years later, when the technology and measurement technologies are better, you're now a 5, or you're out. That's not what we want to do. So we have a little different perspective, but we still, we're coming out with our own GHG intensity protocol that we feel addresses the EO needs, and we're vetting that with MIQ. So we're working together on that to make sure that we are consistent.
I think that really brings us to our next question, which is on emission factors. So until we had direct measurement, it was really just based off of what factors that were used in the market and which ones were actually standards and can be applied. So Maria, for you, the industry has used emission factors traditionally to estimate their emissions, like we discussed. Why do we need direct measurement, and what information do you feel we are missing with the factors that we use today?
So I would say that the main reason why we need direct measurements or move towards more direct measurements is exactly what Jennifer said, that the emissions factors that we currently have tend to either underestimate or overestimate. So, I mean, that can be a good and a bad thing at the same time. And there's so much uncertainty to what out there on what are the factors that we should be using, right? So I do think that we need to transition to more direct measurement until we have a clear understanding on what is okay to be, to remain with emissions factor and what is okay to, or what absolutely needs to be measured, because ideally, right, you have the two different types of emissions, ones that are variable and those that are always gonna be there. So you can do, to a certain point, a mix of emissions factors and direct measurements, but how that's gonna look like is not really clear today. So we need to continue to move toward direct measurements to be able to completely understand how the dynamics of emissions management and direct measurements can play in an ideal scenario. So to provide, the more accurate data that everybody is trying to get today, because at the end of the day, that's what everybody is demanding today, to have accurate data enough that everybody can, feel comfortable with reporting and trusting and making decisions on. So that's why I think it's so important to have trustworthy data.
And Laura, what would you like to add to that?
Wow, this is the $64,000 question.
Yeah.
No, I mean, direct measurement, as a concept, we have to move away from emission factors. We know that from an inventory basis, at least in the US, they're about 60% underreporting our emissions. In some basins, it can be 300%. And that's just talking about production. We understand, we know production pretty well, but we don't know where the warts are in midstream. We don't know where the warts are in LNG. And that research is still evolving. We also know that when it comes to direct measurement, it's how often, what's the uncertainty? How do we do it episodic or short-term emissions versus long persistent emissions? If those were intended emissions, do we only count those, or what do we do about the ones that were, or excuse me, if they're unintended, we only count those versus the ones that were intended? We know right now that it's like playing 3D chess, trying to figure out what the right sampling percentage is. Can we come up with a representative sample size from 2 pads, or do we need 300 pads? So like the Cheniere initiative, the Veritas initiative, OGMP 2.0 are all trying to kind of come at it from a different angle. MIQ, we have our own reconciliation option right now, which is, give us your inventory plus as many other sources as you possibly can, and all the emissions that you identify from your detection. And on top of that, try and accurately avoid emissions using best practices. And only when you have all of those met, you get the lowest grade of all those 3 elements. And so that's the assurance that the buyers of that gas have. But until we calibrate that, until we test that, we don't know how perfect of a system that is. And with all the other measurements protocols that are out there, we have to be a teeny bit patient. And we do have to also give them a year or two to undergo calibrations. So that's why MIQ is working with Veritas. We're staying very closely with OGMP 2.0. We will point to the measurement protocol that we think is the best one when the time comes out.
That's very detailed, and I know it's a very hard question to answer.
Yeah.
So thank you for elaborating. So going back to the principle of continuous improvement, we start with measurement today to understand our emissions sources, to address and reduce, to mitigate what we can. But what about abatement solutions? Is there any quick wins that an operator can use today? And then how do y'all use the term of continuous improvement? We did talk a little bit about both certifications have different levels, which kind of implement that continuous improvement. But is there anything else you can add to that, to where you kind of help the operator walk through that improvement plan? And we'll start with you, Jennifer.
For us, continuous improvement means we require, because we address the whole ESG spectrum, which includes governance. We require that you have processes and procedures set up to address all 5 of these particular elements. What we're seeing is that because companies are all on a journey, some are doing very good practices, but they haven't documented them or properly documented those procedures so that they're auditable. Conversely, policies and procedures may be in place, but they're not being acted on because, we've all worked for organizations that have great aspirations, but then, the problem comes execution. So we give some leeway in that if you've got the processes and procedures on paper, but you're not following them, you get like half credit, but we expect those to converge. And then similarly, if you're behaving and your processes and procedures are okay, but you're not documenting them anywhere, then we expect that documentation. And a good example is something like, because we are a global standard, we have things like, child labor and different issues, people-related issues that really in the U.S. don't matter. And so a smaller company probably isn't going to have a written policy that they're not. I'll give Northeast Natural as a great example. They're PE backed. They have 14 pads or 14 sites in West Virginia. They're very small, so they probably don't have a child labor policy because they operate, I think, in 2 counties in West Virginia. But we still, because we are a global standard, we require that. So they get a half check on that today, but then as they move along in their processes and they start doing, their governance starts to improve, then that converges, and that's what continuous improvement means to us.
That's a very good explanation. I actually personally didn't even realize that you looked at the child labor. Oh, so that's
Just an example.
yeah, I know, but that's interesting. I like it. So Maria, from a Baker Hughes standpoint, what abatement opportunities are there for a quick win for an operator? And then some of the stuff that maybe Baker Hughes is looking at the long term that we might not have today, but something we're looking at providing in the future.
Sure. Yeah, I guess as I said, we're trying to take a very broad perspective on our emissions management strategy and how we can support customers on this journey. We understand that first of all, it's a journey, so you are not going to get to your target, in 1-2 years. So you really need to set up a strategy that is short, medium, and long term. And we're putting internally, we're actually collaborating in partnership with some companies that have the expertise to suggest those kind of, solutions. We do have the technology, but sometimes, we wouldn't have that level of, kind of consulting kind of capability directly with some of the operators who need that kind of support. So we do partner with some consulting companies that are able to collaborate with us and, kind of bring more visibility to what are some of the quick wins that we can provide. We have in our portfolio today 28 solutions for abatement that cover different aspects of the operation. So we have a technology that is very well known, that is Flare IQ, that helps you to do both things, to efficient to mix better the oxygen with the gas that you burn. So you basically reduce the amount of methane that you're releasing to the atmosphere. And it also helps you to measure the efficiency of your flare. So that's 2 things right there. But the amount of methane that you're going to be releasing to the atmosphere is going to be significantly less because you're basically going to convert it into CO2. So that's one kind of way to reduce your methane emissions. But we have several other solutions that touch on other aspects of the operation, and we are continuing to identify ways in which we can support customers not only on measuring but also on even mitigating the emission sources or reducing the emission sources that have to be there, but that you can actually do something to efficient those emissions. So that's one way. And the other way is, as I was saying, we're partnering with some of these consulting firms that can support more the customers to lay down a longer term strategy. And I love the way of thinking of one of the partners we're talking to, that they identify quick wins below $10,000, and they consider it to be, some of the things that you can easily implement. And sometimes they don't even suggest technology. Like, I agree, like sometimes the change is not going to come only from technology, it's also going to come from people, organizational change. So I love that way of thinking, and that's kind of the type of mindset that we're also trying to have at Baker Hughes, that, the change is gonna come from different angles, and we understand that it's a journey, and we wanna be there to support.
Thank you, Maria. And then Laura, to add on to the continuous improvement on the MIQ side, what can you provide?
So we basically have a number of best practices that are capital improvements. I mean, these are things that are long-term, multi-year, require a lot of budgeting, a lot of financing in order to improve. And so what we try and put inside of our standard is a demonstration towards a target, so that you can enter into the program having done, okay, well, we've replaced 25% of our pneumatics with no bleed, or we've moved, abandoning these vertical wells in place of these horizontal wells with the centralized facilities. This is how many of our wells now have vapor capture units. So we give them a program that they can comply with, and by getting certification, that typically helps them in a circular way to receive the funding that they need to follow up on those projects. So, and with the monitoring, the biggest win that we've seen from, and in Northeast Natural is a great example, is it was the first time they actually looked at their whole facility from a facility scale and saw where their gaps were. So that first opportunity to look at it voluntarily without the risk of having to report on those emissions to any regulatory agency gave them a lot of insight just into where they needed to be staffing better, where they needed to be putting their manpower. Because at the end of the day, the manpower, even though that is one of the most expensive tools, it's one of the most effective tools. It's just the response to that information.
I want to add one little anecdote to what Lara said, is that once NNE entered into this process, they created a role just to manage the certification and other ESG elements. So you're seeing this certification, the market phenomenon, creating jobs. So I mean, it's very good.
I'm glad you added that, because you actually can see that on LinkedIn today. If you go and look, a lot of the operators that we're working with are creating positions for these roles. So I think it does open a lot of opportunity and a lot of movement. What I'd like to go to next is kind of talking about, we've talked about what the certifications do and the implications of those on operators, but I don't want to hide the fact that it does take a lot on the operator side in order to get to these certifications. There's a lot of time commitment. There's a lot of paperwork. It takes when I've spoken with customers about it, they're like, oh, we're in a 5-month deal with MIQ right now. It's going to take a long time to look at everything. So from y'all's standpoint, when you're talking with these operators and the customers, what do you think is pushing them to actually go to these links and do it? Because it does take a lot of commitment. And what are you seeing? Because it is a voluntary commitment, right? So what other positives are they getting out of it that make it, something that they want to move forward with? And we'll start with Jennifer.
Gosh, I could talk all day on that topic, but I won't. So what I like is, if you look at the Chesapeake Investor Relations deck that they put out about 30 days ago or so, they talk about why they got EO certification of their production, and it was to credentialize themselves to the public that their ESG practices are strong and have been validated by an external independent third party. It's more of a credentializing for some companies to their stakeholders, to their investors, their employees, their insurance companies. I was in a discussion, we had a discussion with a bank, a large oil and gas lending bank a few weeks ago, where they said they're thinking about, if one of their customers has their production certified, they will get a lower rate on their debt. And that lowers your cost of capital. And so if that's not a compelling reason for certification, I don't know what is. So so there's the external branding, if you will, the external credentialization, lowering your cost of capital, getting pressure off your back from investors, NGOs, whatever. And then, but finally, it started out. This phenomenon started actually with Southwestern Energy in 2018, selling certified gas at a premium to 3 different utilities, 2 that were public and 1 that was private, just not disclosed. And Southwestern was able to achieve a substantial premium, and So then everyone got really excited, oh, we can sell this gas, and we can make this investment, and then we can recoup that investment with a premium. Personally, this is my view, not an EO view. I don't know that the premiums are what they were or what they might be expected to be. Heard anecdotally that, you know, for example, Cheniere has come out and says that we will not pay a premium for certified gas. It's just, that's not, you shouldn't be paid a premium for doing what we expect you to do in the first place. So Cheniere being one of the largest buyers of nat gas in the United States, that's pretty influential. That being said, there's legislation that's being passed in several states that allows the premium to be passed on to the ratepayers without going to a rate case. So there may be some traction there, but we get asked a lot when we propose to produce, when we give our presentation to producer, the main reaction is, what's our ROI on this? What's my return on investment? And we can't give a, you know, we can't give a nice Excel spreadsheet that shows this is your ROI, because some of it's intangible. And we don't play price, but we're not marketers. So if you get a premium, that's up to you and whoever you're buying the gas from on a privately negotiated basis. So it's three things. It's external credentialization. It's possibly lowering your cost of capital, and then possibly getting a premium.
And then Laura, what could you add to that?
I mean, Jennifer hit it
Yeah.
on the head. You know, although as we go into the future, the buyers of that gas, as well as the producers, have these net zero commitments that they have to figure out a way to achieve. And right now, their cheapest option is reduction. And the most valid option is reduction, because there aren't enough offsets in the world to actually achieve these net zero commitments. I mean, we've done the math that I think it would like cover like less than 1% of what the net zero commitments are out there. Science-based targets are looking, how can we like actually, you know, certify, or not certify, but create an oil and gas standard for this. So if you're looking at how do I meet these net zero commitments, the cost of carbon, the cost of those offsets is going to be substantial. And right now, even though you probably agree with Jennifer, you shouldn't necessarily be getting paid for doing what you're doing anyway. If you're looking at what the cost of traditional gas is and the cost of those offsets versus a reduction in certified gas that you can demonstrate, especially when you use the actual greenhouse global warming potential of 80 to 86 degree times CO2e, that's a big chunk. That's a big chunk of your scope 1 as a producer, and it's a huge chunk of your scope 3 as a buyer. So we're really working hard, at least at MIQ and with our parent company, our mind is to make not just investors, but ultimately the carbon market aware of what it means to use certified gas in order to demonstrate those reductions.
Yeah, so there is definitely benefits. And I think what's important too is to look at kind of what other countries are doing. So in the EU, they've draft regulation that if looking to adopt the multi-stakeholder industry initiative, which is the OGMP 2.0, this is a regulatory requirement. What are we missing in the USA, do you think, to make such an existing voluntary initiative actually a standard or a basis or foundation for these companies that have to maybe move forward and do this in order to even play in the market? Jennifer. Yeah, think about it for a second.
I mean, if your question is, you know, should regulation pick up the concept of performance standards? Yes, all day long, because then it gives the operators the opportunity to say, I'm going to use the most cost-effective, smartest, simplest, common sense method of achieving that performance level, rather than checking boxes all day long. And that is one of the I think wins we had with the EU methane strategy, was getting them to understand the benefit of a performance standard versus a prescriptive standard like we tend to focus on here in the US. What was the second part of the question?
It was basically just asking, do you think, or is there a process that maybe we're missing that's in place to be able to have this as a standard? Or is it just so that it's so new? Because I feel like really in the market, it's so relatively new and there's so many different ways to like be certified. If maybe that is kind of part of the problem for why we don't have a standard yet.
Or like a single certification.
Yeah, a single
standard.
standard,
I mean, it's incredibly new. I think it's, MIQ, we've been actually certifying for a year and a half. I mean, EO's been doing this for much longer, but other programs, again, I don't think they date back quite as far back as the Southwest Energy. But there has to be convergence, and there will be convergence. The thing that we're doing, and I know EO is doing, is we're not going to succumb on our principles. We're always going to say that all standards have to be transparent. They all have to be audited. That data in and of itself is not certification, and that will mean that other standards will probably converge towards that. Same thing with the measurement principles that we talked about before. OGMP 2.0 is gonna spend the next year or two calibrating their methodology and moving people towards Gladstone level 5 measurement. If that works, we already know that there's not enough adoption. That's still a voluntary requirement. But if we can get this to be really, really popular in one very, very active part of the world, that's what's going to eventually lead to that globalization of that standardization for all programs.
And do you ever see concerns with there being trustworthy in the market, and kind of how that might be a differentiator in why it hasn't standardized yet, and what can you do to make sure that it is a trustworthy implication or like a certification for these operators?
I mean, I hate to admit it, but if you look up media articles on RSG, they all lean back to, is this greenwashing? That's what every single one of those stories eventually asks, is this just another form of greenwashing? So, even though we know that the program, and if you look at it 5 years from now, what it wants to achieve, the goal is not greenwashing, but in the near term, because of all the ability to put a green stamp or sticker on your lapel, it does have that risk. So if your standards are black box, if your standards are, if your data is embedded or incestuously, part of the whole certification program, that does put the concept of RSG at risk, in our opinion, and which is why I think that until there is agreement that any type of certification has to have this certain level of credibility, like this is what credibility is, that narrative is going to be out there. So we can only really combat that with, just trying to make everybody better, trying to make everybody rise to our level.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense and understandable, given that it's such a new thing for the market. Maria, coming from the Baker Hughes perspective, we're seeing more collaboration, and you do a lot of that in your work, and dialogue and understanding what the way forward should be for emission reductions. What's the importance to collaborate with groups and organizations and their guiding of the industry efforts on emission reductions?
Yeah, so I think, the energy transition challenge overall, and obviously, we look at emissions management, but the challenge overall is so broad that it's so impossible to do it, in isolation. So that's why we see the importance on collaborating with multiple groups, private, public sector, NGOs. We are really collaborating with with policy, because we see all of these elements coming together. I do not see them coming together in a way of chaos, right? Like they're actually, those are different pieces of the puzzle that are finally aligning and coming together for a much larger purpose, that is, provide a transparent framework on how to manage the emissions for companies. So I guess that's kind of the overarching purpose on having this type of collaborations, that whatever framework we have as a result of these multiple dialogues and these multiple work streams is agreed and is robust enough that is adapted by the industry, right? Because that's kind of the purpose. How do we ensure the longevity and the adoption of protocols that everybody agrees with and everybody accepts? So that's kind of the main challenge, and that's why we see the importance of collaborating with different groups. We are obviously, always in connection with MIQ, Equitable, Origin, but equally with other organizations around the world, like OGMP 2.0 is one that is very strong in Europe. As you heard, that was literally embedded into the European Union draft for emissions management. So it has around 72 oil and gas operators that represents a third of oil and gas production in the world. So it's gonna be a very important one. We are also part of methane guiding principles that is issuing different protocols on how to manage different emission sources and what actions to take to reduce emissions there. And it's coming with different tools to provide more visibility and more transparency on the data that is reported. We also are part of the, we have a collaboration with OGCI, that is also a group that is, advancing technology. So there's multiple groups out there that, you see it in a way, there's definitely multiple parties working towards the same target. And I do think it's important that, we continue to have that dialogue where, we finally reach consensus and agreement on how, the emissions management strategy is gonna look for the industry, because that's kind of the ultimate goal of this, that we have tools and we have frameworks and we have protocols that are adopted across the board of oil and gas.
Thank you for that, Maria. And Jennifer, so you've been in the industry for a long time. You even retired and decided to come back. You've seen an evolution. I know from your standpoint, you worked for operators, you've worked for service companies as well. You had a time at Baker Hughes as well and saw some of the development of the technology. What have you seen be the biggest change within these last few years, and how did COVID impact that change?
Well, the first question, I can give an anecdote. When I was at Southwestern Energy, I had many roles. My final role there was the SVP of Policy, Regulatory, ESG, and Environment, and I reported directly to the CEO. And he knew he needed something, and he needed a person in this spot, but I kept telling him, I remember just kept trying to message about how important ESG is and climate and the fact that Southwestern Energy is at the forefront of all this. This is something that he needs to tell the story. And it's like, yeah. It's just like, as a CEO of a public traded company, all you hear about share price. It's like, I don't want, blah, 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 blah. I got, my big investors are breathing down my neck and board breathing down my neck. All I care about my share price. This has no impact on my share price until he had an investor day, and you only get on investor days, you only get 30 minutes to talk to potential investors. And that in a 30-minute conversation, 20 of it was focused on environmental issues. And my phone just blew up. Oh my God. And I wanted to say, I told you so, but I wanted to keep my job. So I did. So that was, to me, that was when, the CEO of a publicly traded company, the light bulb went off on him, that this is important and investors care about this. Mm-hmm. And that legitimized, not to say that nothing Southwestern ever did was today, or even today, was greenwashing. Actually, that company was way ahead of any other producer in the U.S. Back at that time. But it told the CEO that investors care about this, and that became important to him and serious to him. So then in every single investor call that he had, in the quarterly calls, he opened with some type of environmental statement to reflect what Southwestern was doing. So that's, to me, that's how things have changed. And then you see, sitting, I was at Baker Hughes for about 18 months, and now sitting on this side with EO, you see producers in various parts of the journey, some that are truly dedicated. They make public statements, provocative public statements. They're truly dedicated to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and their intensity and how they operate. There's some that say they do, but really don't. And then there's some that just don't care and are going to do the minimum requirements, and they're going to be kicking and screaming along. And I think that last category is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then finally on COVID, I think I'm kind of conflicted. I think it slowed things down a little bit because we couldn't have conferences like this. We couldn't have in-person meetings. But at the same time, I think when you see, I was chairing a carbon tracking conference last week, and there was a gentleman there from NASA who they looked at global emissions pre-COVID and during COVID, and the amount of emissions that were reduced on a global basis was it was just staggering. And then I really think that opened people's eyes to say we have a long ways to go.
Mm. And then Laura, you've had a extensive career as well on the climate side, and then like I was looking at your LinkedIn earlier, and it's very interesting kind of your development into where you are today. So what have you seen evolve? And I even believe that you graduated in mining, or you had like a mining technology degree. So how has that evolved even in that space, in mining and the environmental aspects of that?
So I did most of my career in renewables, working for companies that were selling energy, geothermal specifically, and then, you know, with a diversified portfolio of renewable power plants, which provide both base load and peak load, and then, you know, being able to supply certain countries. So I worked extensively in both Iceland and New Zealand and Guatemala, which are all 100% renewable. They could be if they had 150% of that, like all tied into the grid. So that goal of 100% renewable energy is not, it's not a real thing yet, even in countries that have enough to export it like all day long. So one of the things that you know, we discovered is that without renewables, you still can't get away from gas anytime all that soon. So, and now, okay, well, what are the other solutions that are going to kind of fit in there that are going to help bridge that gap? I mean, maybe it's hydrogen. Again, you can't get away from hydrogen without natural gas. So at the end of the day, we have to be very, you know, open and transparent and accepting of the fact that part of the equation for using gas responsibly is understanding its leakage. Because once we get towards 2 or 3% leakage, it's worse than coal. And when we can make it at a 0% or as close to 0% leakage, it really is a fuel that blends well with the whole entire energy economy. Mm-hmm. But it's something that's still poorly understood. The IPCC suggests that methane from all the sectors, from waste, from agriculture, what have you, is almost as responsible as carbon to date for the measured warming that the globe has achieved. So while it is you know, a near-term climate pollutant, it's something that we you know, don't think about in terms of the same scale or the same impact long-term as carbon. It's also a huge win. We need to recognize this as an opportunity, not as a risk. And allow all the integrated energy solutions to understand that you know, recognizing the value of reducing methane is an opportunity and not just a risk. So you know, the fact that renewables went from not even knowing what methane was, how it fit into the picture, do I have to care about this, to now the electrical utilities that I used to work for, that I now talk to about selling them certified gas. It's front of mind, they get it, it's part of the blended solution, and I think that's been a big win.
That's awesome. And lastly, for our last question for you, Maria, so the next generation, it's really important that we, you know, foster an environment so that we continue to have people come into our space and come into energy. You know, you've been in the career with Baker Hughes for about 3 years now. You've had an extensive career actually outside of the United States when you were graduating and what you were doing in environmental. What inspired you to get into this industry, and what keeps you here?
Yeah. So it was quite a, you know, a long journey to realize why I wanted to be here. But everything started when I'm a chemical engineering by background, and I did realize all of the pollution that we really do in different processes, and that are really not really optimized. So, you know, when I realized that in university, I was like, okay, so I think I need to do something. So I specialized in environmental, and I started to work in different projects to reduce emissions, not only in air, but also in soil and water. And, you know, I think I did realize at the time that emissions and the climate impact was so broad that it was going to be really, really hard to target. And if we talk about emissions management, right, we can't hide the fact that there are other sectors out there that are emitting pollution. I mean, we have agriculture that is much larger than oil and gas, really. But you know, when I realized that, or when I was deciding which way to go, I really thought that the energy sector had, you know, kind of all the elements to be able to target the emissions that they did have. And that's exactly what I started to see, you know, a few years ago, that the energy sector, you know, has the opportunity to tackle the methane problem, and it's actually considered one of the quick wins that they can do. It's cost effective to do it. The actions, the technology that they need to do it is there. So I realized that by being in this sector, I was going to be able to do a much more immediate impact than by being on the other sectors. So that was, you know, kind of the main thing that motivated, encouraged me to jump into the energy sector and be involved in the emissions management. I can tell you that I did take a break, right? It was like 2 years of not seeing much traction on this topic until, you know, things started to pick up after COP26. So I definitely, I am seeing much traction, and really, from my perspective, is also sort of taking the responsibility on the generation that is becoming, sort of coming behind me, that is pushing us to take action. So that was also another thing that, you know, kind of made me realize that I do have a responsibility to kind of not disappoint the generations that are coming behind me. So that was why I decided to, you know, jump back into this field again. And it's definitely not an easy challenge, but I am excited because I think whatever we do is gonna be a way in which we can serve future generations. So that's you know, kind of what inspired me to do that.
I love that. Thank you, Maria. I think it's really important too that we understand that if you want to change the industry, you need to join us. So I think that's something we all need to understand, and I think that's one thing that we all need to push, because we're not going to be here if we don't have that next generation. And that all starts with, one, being cleaner through certification, and then also voicing that we're here to have those technologies that can get us there. So I think that closes the panel, unless there's anything that you ladies want to add. And then also, if there's any questions, we'd love to take those questions as well.